Hello and welcome to the Data Diaries. This is the show where we discuss all things data. Today we're in person and I'm joined by Jon. Do you want to give yourself an intro, Jon?
Yeah, thank you. So Jon Hammant. So I lead the compute business for Amazon Web Services for EMEA. Well, that's my quick intro. I can give you a longer.
That'd be perfect. Yeah, if you
one.
want to give a bit of background.
Jon Hammant. So I've been in IT for literally as long as I can remember. So started it back as a 3-year-old on a BBC Micro. I'm very dyslexic, so I couldn't spell my own name till I was 11. But for me, IT really clicked. I think people sometimes talk about this hyper-focus thing of dyslexia. So started coding my BBC Micro when I was 3. Got really into development and interesting early bits of IT security on the EMEA. Did my GCSE when I was 11, did my A-level computer science when I was 13, went through into the world of tech, and then what did I do? Well, after did computer science at uni, as you may expect, and then since then I've done a whole bunch of things. Was IT contractor for a while, which was really fun. I liked the world of contracting when it was going, so worked specifically in the field of low latency. So was the one of the tech leads that built the stock exchange that trades at the moment. So
Wow.
learned loads of stuff about how to. It turns out strangely that building a stock exchange is moderately similar to building demos on the Amiga in terms of what you need to know. It's weird to say. So in terms of assembler and things like that. So was one of the tech leads on the stock exchange, then moved into the world of banking. So led low latency for Deutsche Bank, so ran all that for Europe. Worked at Goldman's, which I was amazed about the time worked out. Then Credit Suisse, and was head of infrastructure at Standard Chartered. Then decided to go into consulting because I'd met a load of consultants and I didn't think they were very good. So I thought that I'd give it a go because I thought if they could do it, I could do it. So was a director leading cloud and DevOps for a company called EPAM, and then I was a managing director at Accenture. So ran the DevOps and full stack engineering businesses for the UK, and all of Accenture's DevOps globally. So we had a thing called a DevOps platform, which is kind of almost like Backstage by Spotify, but a little bit earlier. So ran that globally for them, and then thought I'd have a bit of a change. I thought the cloud providers were really interesting. I really genuinely liked what AWS were doing. I thought they were my cloud provider of choice for myself. I went out and got certified in AWS, Google, and Azure because I thought I'd give all of them a go, and decided that actually AWS from their product catalog portfolio, what they were doing was the right one, and I've been there for last 3.5 years. But also personally, 3 kids, really busy life. Saying to you earlier, cycle everywhere, which I like. But yeah, that's me.
Amazing. How did you find that transition from consultancy going into that sort of cloud? Was it quite a big change?
Yeah, it was quite. I mean, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed in my career is almost seeing different sides of the table. I think it's really interesting when you get some people who've just they've just been on the buy side, they've just been on the sell side. I really like the fact that I've seen the different pieces of it because I often feel like I never like being sold to. I wanted people who are honest and transparent and said what was going on. And I think because I've had both sides of that table, and I've now had the consulting bit that the partners that facilitate it, it's quite useful to have the experience around it actually. In terms of differently, it amazes me how different it is not having consultancy to an extent is a P times Q business. It's how many people, what's the day rate. And it's been interesting going that into a pure software business where it's fascinating. Some of the stuff we build has giant world-changing implications because we run tens or thousands or millions of times, which I find absolutely fascinating. That and the sheer size and impact of Amazon just blows my mind. It really does. It's fantastic.
Has it consistently blown your mind in the time that you've been there, or are there still new things that you're discovering that are a bit mind-blowing?
I think some of the new stuff we're doing is amazing. So I'm really happy to see we launched 2 satellites that went up successfully that day for Kuiper. So we're now in the process. We have a FCC license to launch 3,000. Let's get the numbers right. 3,400-ish satellites in the next 2 years. And I think we've got another constellation of 3,000 to 4,000 extra. So the fact that, if you think from a historic perspective, 5 years ago, in all of time, there had only been about 1,500 satellites ever launched. And we, in the next couple of years, will launch, multiple times the total amount of satellites that ever existed. I find crazy. I mean, I see the size of we have some internal tooling where you can see the size of the pools and the usage behind the cloud. and it's just absolutely mind blowing. We have fun with it sometimes. So part of the business that I run is our high performance and advanced computing piece, and we had a while back we spun up a supercomputer on the weekend in Dublin, and it got into the probably about close to the top 15, top 20 supercomputers in the world, and we kind of did it with spare capacity.
I love that. It's just casually spinning up a few supercomputer.
Yeah, it's really fun. Yeah, it's really fun actually. So no, it does continually blow my mind, and it's for me, it's really things like AI. I think are getting increasingly interesting, but more than anything, it's just genuinely fantastic seeing the impact that we have on customers. We've got customers we worked with where there's one customer we work with really closely, for example, Untold Studio. That's a VFX house that has no on-premise. Normally VFX houses were really limited by the fact that you need powerful computers on desks, you need all of that, and they've built their business in conjunction with us to a point where it's all in the cloud. So it's just really fun dealing with customers who they've built their business with us from the start, which is brilliant actually.
Yeah, it's quite a nice sort of integration piece, and you can follow their journey, I imagine. But I think that's a good segue, especially on the AI piece of why we're here today and why we're talking. So obviously the topic that we're covering is AI and data ethics. So I think natural segue into the first question I can ask you today. So I suppose it'd be good for a definition, I suppose, first. So what does ethical data and AI mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question actually. What does ethical? Well, I suppose it's a number of different things. I think there's the broader piece of computing ethics, which is increasingly important in terms of understanding the way that people use the capabilities that are being offered to them. You've seen some of the things within facial recognition, for example. Like we've made statements about our facial recognition policy as to who we will and won't sell it to, and I think that's been really important. I think there's the whole piece of computing ethics of understanding the bias that comes out, and more than that, taking into account the impact that some of these systems can have, both from everything from a societal profiling level to the impact that these tools have. I mean, for us, I view it as we are building tools for the 21st century effectively, and it's really important that we make sure they're being done in a safe, in a fair, in an equitable way. And I think that is going to be increasingly challenging to do. I mean, you can see things that have happened over the past weekend where there's been some interesting developments in OpenAI and Microsoft and boards and all these kind of fun stuff that's been happening. More fun, but these interesting things that have been happening.
Popcorn, definitely.
It has been, it has been kind of popcorn time, and I think it highlights that AI ethics is really a board level discussion that people are having. As we go to a point that everyone's starting to talk about Gen AI and the implications that come around it. People have to be really, really aware of what those implications can be, and I think it becomes an interesting challenge on Gen AI, because looking at the data that in the end of the day, there is huge bias out there in the internet, even in very basic things. So in languages, for example, there's a huge bias towards English. There's huge biases towards gender and sexual stereotypes because of the training sets. So you kind of get this really interesting point of when you have an inherently biased training set, how do you take that and how do you unbias that? And then when you do try and unbias it, where do you get it to? And that's I think an area that every company, as they go into this, will have to work out how they approach, how they deal with it, because it's just really important for the world, honestly, that we get it right.
Do you think boards are having these conversations at the moment?
Yeah, we talk to a few people around it. So I think it's definitely, there. I think the challenge with all of it actually is, this is a really, really new technology. I mean, it's really interesting. So if I think back to computer science at university for me, I mean, I did neural networks 20 something years ago, and it was very much Tower of Hanoi puzzle, these simple things. And, even by personal opinion, I am interestingly surprised by how far LLMs have managed to go. Actually, there was a piece a few years ago that was on the TensorFlow site. You could do this piece where you built a Spanish to English translator, which is something I did quite a while ago. It was one of the tutorials. It makes it sound more impressive than it is, but it was really cool because you could take advantage of the fact that the UN publish all of their documents in multiple different languages. You effectively could vectorize all those documents, so you could work out how far each word is to each other word. You have the two big matrix vectors, one of your English one your Spanish one. You effectively make an equivalency between the whole thing. So things like that have been done. But I think the fact that we've effectively been able to ingest the whole of the internet, combined with all media you can find, and turn that into a big multi-layered neural network it's just bonkers. And it's, so much of that I think is a result of us getting to the kind of pointy end of Moore's law. So, exponential scaling, as people have noticed more, I think, from the pandemic, exponential scaling gets very, very interesting when you get to the high parts of this exponential scaling piece. So the challenge I see for boards at the moment is that the technology is probably moving quicker than a lot of boards move. If you look at the cadence that boards tend to meet at, how often they'll tend to adjust these things. The time I used to write board papers in Accenture and did it for a few quite large FTSE companies about various things. And getting those board papers together will often take 3, 6, 9 months to get some of the IT strategy papers together. And where I think it's interesting and where the challenge lies is 9 months from now, I think the landscape will look dramatically different from what it does today. I mean, I think in all honesty, 3 months from now, it'll probably look quite different. So how do you deal with that as a board? And I think part of it will come to a point of getting not necessarily experts sitting on the board, but I think you'll have to get far more specific, knowledgeable people to try and work out how you increase the cadence of them and be able to deal with that. And I think that comes squarely into that some of those ethical considerations will be front and centre around it.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've almost got to be predictive in the same way that sort of LLMs are predictive, I suppose, with what's going to happen in sort of 3, 9, 6 months, and how do you pivot with that as well?
Well, it's how you do that, and also how do you there's this whole interesting things around first mover advantage. At what point do you want to just follow what the market does? At what point do you want to lead it? Where do you get that right? And it's interesting because I think now, you can see actually that there is huge both opportunity and risk for so many companies in this space. I mean, I do really think I was away on the weekend, went to Madrid, which was lovely, but we thought, okay, we'll do a scavenger hunt app where we came on and we kind of downloaded this online scavenger hunt to do a tour of Madrid because we wanted to walk around it at the time. And I thought what was interesting is the results of this app that we paid 20 quid or so. Actually, we played about and I could get ChatGPT to do something that was probably far better than that in a very, very short period of time. So I think there's all of these companies out there that their business models are just going to be massively, massively transformed by this.
Yeah.
So yes, it's really interesting. And I think that's across the field of enterprise consulting. I think people will more and more go to this position where they work hand in hand and tandem with the AI that's sitting next to them, which is kind of cool actually.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I mean, taking that, I suppose, theoretical question, if you were a board member, and you're trying to predict the next sort of 6, 9, 12 months, what are the benefits and the dangers, I suppose, of current data and AI? And how do we need to consider that and I suppose prepare for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it it's interesting. So the phrase that I heard quite regularly over the last few years were people saying that data is the new oil. So people often use this phrase. Yeah, and I think really, and so you'd have this data is the new oil. People would go off and they'd build data lakes. The reality we would often talk to customers and they would say they don't have a data lake, they have a data swamp where the whole thing is, it doesn't necessarily work as well as it should. They can't get the answers out. Their operational data lake isn't quite where it is. I think where generative AI and some of the machine learning concepts themselves, it's got that ability to take all of that data you have and to really unlock it. It almost feels to me like the combustion engine to the oil that exists rather than the previous oil lamps that we were trying to do to burn the thing. So I think increasingly people are going to explore the space of their data using AI, and I think that's a really, really interesting thing. But how do you get to that? Well, a lot of it actually it's the fundamentals. It's where is your data catalogued? How is it stored? What are the permissions? And there's all these making sure, for example, and really based on things. If you have an LLM and you train it on your data, well, what data did you train the thing on? Making sure how you work out permission. There's been a number of stories recently of people asking LLMs to just tell them the data they have, and so you've got to get some of that permissioning, some of the standards in it. I think also use cases are really interesting. I'm a firm believer of exploring things through play. I really do. I think we want people to experiment. We want them to be able to try different things and work out what those use cases are. So I think getting those basics right so you can scale are just increasingly important. I think you can see as well in games how how I think games are just a brilliant thing for seeing how the world moves. And if you look back to chess, I think it's a fantastic kind of parallel to where I see AI going. So, you had Kasparov beaten by Deep Blue back in the 89, 90 or something around that. And you had this interesting period where for a very long period of time, computers reigned supreme in the world of chess, and that's through Stockfish and AlphaZero and AlphaGo and all the people around it. What's interesting now, so some of the best players, or the leading players on chess on this planet, are what are called either correspondence or chimera chess. And so it's this whole idea where you have a person playing chess and they work out the strategy, and you combine them with your kind of friendly AI who does the tactics, and you kind of have this combination between the two, and that ends up being the best players in chess at the moment. And I think that's what's going to happen in the world of business really, really quickly. And I think people will be doing it before they even know it's happening. It's kind of going to be there. And I think this idea that you effectively enhance your staff by giving them just better tooling, I truly believe people will still be responsible for the strategy. They'll still be responsible for the direction. And I think for a long time, I see them being by far the best at that. But allowing them to have access to, these useful AIs or these useful machines that can help fill in those tactics around it, that's really where I see it going. So what would I say to a board? I would really start to think of how do you build that machine person connection, because it's happening loads of other things. Like, if you think of flights, for example, I remember, I'm old enough to remember going into a travel agent and talking to them and saying, right, I want to book a flight somewhere. They pull up a screen, off we go, and that just wouldn't happen now. There's just it just seems bizarre, and so I think you'll find that it slips into places, and that combination between people and machines will become increasingly key for every business and every career.
So is that the end point of the sort of beneficial side of AI then, that sort of almost personal, AI? I suppose, we were talking a little bit about Marvel before the podcast, but you could almost think like a Jarvis type of personal assistant that assists you with everything. Or I suppose you could even relate it to OpenAI's sort of GBT builder, where you're building specific for your needs, basically.
Oh, totally. We launched something just last week, which I would recommend people play with because it's really fun, called Party Rock, and effectively it is an LLM training system. So you can go in and you can tell it you want to create an app. You can tell it I want to make an app, for a city tour, for example, and it will build a string of different LLM inputs which are chained together to create these kind of apps out of it. And I think that is going to be a really interesting change. I think, and I think adding to productivity. Like I on the side, I quite like taking photos. I've got 3 kids, so I'm constantly running off the house. Just I like having photos and family memories. And it's really interesting seeing how impactful AI is becoming in the creative industry. I think everything from you've got your mid-journeys, it's completely creating almost. But I think things like generative fill, I think some of the fantastic stuff which is coming into the Adobe suite at the moment is just absolutely unbelievable. And I think it's how do you make people more productive? I'm lucky enough to get to talk to a bunch of C-suite folk, pretty regularly, and I think actually things like Code Whisperer, Code Whisperer, if folk that don't know, so Code Whisperer effectively for us is our AI code completion recommendation engine effectively. So you can turn around and say, I want a function which does this, and it will fill the code in. It's really cool actually. But we're seeing more and more, I think, all developers, in the same way that most developers, or I'd say almost all developers, will use Google or will use Stack Overflow. I would put a pretty decent bet by the end of 2024, it will be surprising to find a developer who isn't using something like Code Whisper or GitHub Copilot on their everyday tasks, and that is a massive change. Be really clear. There's a huge change for a group which are normally relatively slow to embrace change, and I think that the people that can use it will do very, very well. But people will be doing, how do you do that? How do you train it on your own source code? How do you work? And that ability effectively to, if you think from a corporate perspective, all of a sudden, if you can make all of your developers, an extra 2x or 3x productive, which is where some of these stats come out, as amazing as it sounds. What do you do when you've suddenly got a bunch more productive developers. Do you take it on one side where you cut them down and you thin out and you lean the team? It's one option. Or do you try and make more with it? Do you try and see actually how you can grow the pie and how you can increase productivity, increase the outputs around it, but keeping the same, increase that customer size? So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I could talk about that for a long time, but I suppose thinking about the other side of the coin to this, what are some of the dangers? Thinking in that sort of ethical consideration.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's been so I think it's a strange world if we get to one where we routinely don't know if we're talking to an AI or a person. So I do think actually that regulation is a very good thing, and regulation needs to come in this. I think you can see the AI, the executive order that came in. I think that the Japanese are doing quite well. I can get some details around that. I think there does need to be loose regulation around this. I think if we regulate too hard and too quickly, I think we will stifle innovation around it. I just really do. But on the same time, it's extremely important that we protect people. Basically, that is the most important thing. All of this is making sure that we have a human-centric view. Where we go to on that, I think is, and then also for businesses want clarity. I think that's one of the key things. They want to understand, where to put investments on things that will make sense in the longer term. So it's kind of key. Some of the larger scale worries that we hear, it's really interesting. I never thought I'd hear so many conversations about, world-ending, like societal level AGI threats as I do. I mean, do I personally worry about things like that? Not really. I think what we do need to make sure that we're careful of is how people worry me far more than machines, and I think they will worry me far more than machines for a very, very, very long period of time. And I do think, looking at political advertising, how it should run, those are the kind of bits where I think we need to be careful of. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see how far LLMs can go. And I don't. If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a very rich man probably. But I think it will be. I think they, from all I can see at the moment, they can probably go a fair bit further. Actually, I suspect that we'll start to get some really interesting multimodal, multi-simulation LLMs will start to turn up. It's interesting when you see just the sheer progression that we've had in a short period of time. I think has been absolutely fantastic. And I do think going to a situation where people are starting to work in concert with it more is kind of where we are. Where do I see the problems? I mean, it's if I take before the LLM challenge and piece together, like autonomous vehicles, something that I also have run a fair bit for Europe. Autonomous vehicles are really interesting. I do think that all the customers I interact with that are in this space, I do think we're probably going to get to level 4 automation in not too distant future. So for folk that don't know it, effectively level 4 is when the car can drive in most circumstances. So, level 5 is all circumstances. I'd argue I'm probably not a level 5 driver because if it's too snowy and it's there's fog, I can't actually drive personally. So I think level 5 is probably a very long way off. But level 4, I suspect, isn't that far. If you think of America, so close to 9% of America are in driving-related jobs. So it's just really interesting if you start thinking what happens from that side of things. And that's an area that's been coming for quite some time. And I think realistically, we will need to think about ways to make sure that we're giving enough retraining, make sure that we're putting skills in. We came out the other day and announced that we're going to try and train 2 million people in AI skills and effectively to work out how to use it. I think there's going to have to be a lot more effort within that. I think it's going to be interesting from a safety perspective of what it does to education in general. I'm really it's going to be interesting. You're thinking back of how would I have used this if I was doing my exams or doing coursework. I mean, I probably would have asked an AI of what I'm doing. I mean, being really transparent, I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't.
Yeah.
So how we start to think about coursework and homework around it is going to be an interesting challenge. But then on the flip side, I think there is so much opportunity because You know, I mean, it always amazes me. My child's in a class with like 29 other children. I couldn't teach 30 kids. I mean, not in the slightest to give them enough time.
Yeah.
But I think going to a position where each one of those children, as well as the teacher, so supplementing that teacher, have an AI which knows them, which understands how they learn, which understands the time, all of that detail, the ability for it to just revolutionise the quality of education, not just for the West, but for the global South, for the whole planet, it's just unbelievable. And I think, I think the positives in this just vastly, vastly outweigh the negatives. I think the challenge is just making sure we do it right, because, obviously, if, like anything, if we get this wrong, there's relatively serious things that could end up happening.
Yeah, but like you said, it will probably be on a person using AI to do bad rather than the AI itself, because again, it's a tool rather than anything else.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's almost the unintended consequences of where this will go. I think it's going to be really fascinating. So drones always amaze me. So the whole reason we've ended up with drones to a large extent is because of mobile phones, as weird as that sounds. Because so if you had mobile phones, originally they used to just ring, you'd have constant ringing noise everywhere. People realised actually people don't want things that ring all the time, because it's just not fantastic. So went to a point where everyone had vibrating alert on their phones. So then all of a sudden, all of this investment cash went into making these smaller and smaller motors to put in smaller and smaller phones. The whole way we ended up with small enough motors to effectively put on drones to fly around was a byproduct of all these mobile phone motors coming in. And I think similar things will happen with AI. I think actually there are so many interesting advances that will come almost as a byproduct of what has happened. And I think I think everything from neuroscience to drug discovery to effectively development of technology, I think is really interesting. Even within LLMs themselves, I find it amazing that people will, when you play around with LLMs, you'll set a warmth parameter, for example. So the warmth parameter effectively is the randomness that comes within the LLM. So if you set the warmth parameter to 1, it will always give you the same. So it will give you, the cat's out on the mat, the cat's out on the mat, the cat's out on the mat, or whichever the most likely string is. And if you set it to 0, it will just give you complete gibberish, every gibberish. And what I find so interesting about them is that having a warmth of 0.8, so 80% of the time when you're using an LLM, it says what is most likely the most likely thing next, and 20% of the time it says something that's less likely. I find it so weird that we've got to this number that all of the LLMs, pretty much the chat-based ones that you'll use, have kind of settled on this warmth of 0.8. And the rationale behind that is quite unknown, as weird as it sounds. We can test it, we know that's what people like, but we don't really understand why that is. And I think, again, that's something where I think we start to learn actually of how we work as people by being able to look at a system that's simulatable. So it makes me think of, is that the way that my brain internally is working, that 80% of the time it's going to the next most likely neuron and 20% of the time it's going to something else. So I think there's all this kind of cool stuff that we'll find out about it across the board, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting how the research into AI almost mirrors the research we're doing into understanding how our own brains work. So if we take Meta's recent announcement with Meg,
yes,
I might have told you about that recently. Yeah. So they're simultaneously trying to work out how our brains function and analyze our brain activity to produce images in order to understand how our brains work, so they can apply that to AI. So it's almost like the research is working in parallel. And
this is I think the amazing thing at the moment of what's happening in life. So if you look, I think industrial revolutions are amazing things that do come along once in a while. First being the evolution of steam power and pieces like that. Second being energy and electrification, effectively, and the third being communications and nuclear. I do think when you look at the technologies that are in play at the moment, we are in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution. We really are. I mean, firmly going at kind of hell for leather around it, and I think that's a combination of effectively some of the advances that happen around AI. I think has been absolutely transformative. I think the silicon revolution, the fact that we're getting to this pointy bit of Moore's law, I think is increasingly key. And then I think the cloud side to it as well. I think the fact that we've democratized access to this to anyone, which I think is just brilliant. I mean, the fact that you can go on now and you can spin up or even just use these massively complex systems that there is no way you could distribute them, I think is extremely interesting. I think also its implications that it will have around things like open source, I think will be increasingly interesting. So if you look at how software is developed and how software is run, I think we are getting into this kind of new era where increasingly software will be, some code, some neural network that sits around it. It's interesting if you take, so Elon's fantastic for whatever your views on. It's interesting because he'll announce a lot of stuff that other people maybe won't say publicly.
Yeah.
If you look at autopilot, for example, so now autopilot is 98% just a neural network. So it's some code around it, but it's a big neural network. And it's really interesting if you think that, I would probably willing to bet a lot of software will involve increasingly complex neural networks around it. And that creates all kind of interesting challenges as to how do you codify that, how do you distribute it, how do you develop that when it comes into the world of open source, and all of these things are just huge impact on the life and the direction of technology.
I suppose that naturally leads into the next question. I think, and I think this is especially prevalent with the work that you're doing at AWS, and I think obviously that's on a larger scale, but a lot of companies are looking to push through in terms of scale at a smaller level. But I suppose, how can we scale data and AI ethically?
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. So yeah, I mean, part of my role, I lead some of the foundational AI, so that the self-managed AI effectively. So we deal with quite a lot of people who come into these problems. I think the key thing really, it's as weird as it sounds, it's from the ethical side of it. It's understanding your data. It really is that just basics of knowing, what are the permissions, where does it need to be owned, all of those things that you would do with data as of years ago. You still need to do that now. I mean, I think anyone that says that. I think in general, people that say there's a panacea for something, or there's a way that by doing it this way it will be fixed differently. I just don't believe them. I really don't believe them. And I think that's the same with AI. There's no panacea or ultra easy way to do this. I think so much of it is about understanding the data you have, understanding how it's used, making sure you keep control of it. I think it's interesting as we kind of move forward in this. I would hazard a bet, if I'm honest, the amount of people who are working for companies who are using all kinds of AI systems they shouldn't be, I think is pretty high, if I'm honest. I think is, from talking to people who are doing all kinds of stuff with LLMs where they're putting things in they shouldn't necessarily be. I do think over the course of the next year, and I suppose this would almost be advice to boards, is it's kind of like when the iPhone first turned up, if people remember that. So the iPhone, because I was it's interesting because I've definitely got a job that was removed by technology's progress. I used to be a BlackBerry administrator for a while, so I helped, probably my second ever job, going back a very long time ago, I helped effectively administrate BlackBerries for Citigroup. And then the iPhone kind of turned up, and there was this moment of, at the time, people going, well, I've got this work BlackBerry that I don't particularly like, and it's not as modern, or I've got my personal iPhone that I suddenly is amazing. And so you kind of had this weird situation even back then, where all of a sudden loads of people would just start using their personal iPhone for all these things they were supposed to be doing on their work machine. They kind of did that pretty quickly. And then what you saw happen is companies suddenly almost had this moment of going, well, we can't stop this. We can't stop people doing this. So we need to have a safe, managed way to get people to have iPhones as corporate devices. And then suddenly, the corporate iPhone exploded really quickly. I think the same thing will really happen with LLMs over the course of the next year. I think increasingly, almost every company will have an LLM strategy or an AI strategy. If you don't have one now, they should be working on it, quite honestly. And a lot of that will consist of not blocking things, but giving people a managed portal where they can use. And I think also that we have Bedrock, so we have a specific, effectively foundational model and AI platform. And our belief with that is that what people want to do is they want to put their own data. They want to you want to give your company data into that foundational model to make it more accurate. Whether that's everything from your wikis, your code bases, and some of that's by changing the foundational model itself, and some of that's by using a vector database to level on top for different areas that need being done. And I think increasingly making sure that you offer something to your staff for them to use will be really, really important, because I can pretty much say 100% this time next year, if people don't have the option of using an internal LLM to do or help with some of their tasks, they're just going to use one they shouldn't anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really key thing to have. I think we've just got to embrace this technology, because there will be such advantages to the people that embrace it first. If you think back to the chess analogy, I think the companies that have huge advantages in this kind of first mover pace are the ones that do it well, do it quicker. So yeah, I think fortunes will be made and lost over the next couple of years in this.
I agree. I think, again, linking it back to the education example that you used, I think there's always been a pushback, and there's been a big pushback recently to students shouldn't be using, especially in universities where this has sort of taken them by surprise a little bit. Should students be using AI? Should they be using ChatGPT to write their essays? And they're getting a lot more plagiarism come through. And I saw one lecturer actually, again on LinkedIn, who was saying that she actually integrates AI within her sort of coursework and everything. So she gets them to go home and use GPT to help write the first draft, and they bring it in and then they work on it, on that version, and sort of redraft it together. So it's sort of a new way of working, like you were saying before, with that sort of assistance.
And there's things within it. I mean, the fact that if I wanted to, in a relatively short period of time, I could with literally 20 minutes, using a combination of a text-to-speech API and using, say, Anthropic's Claude, I could get to, and maybe Amazon Recogs or something I could input in, I could get to a position that I could go and interview historical figures. I mean, like, really, as in we could knock it up probably much quicker than the podcast itself will go. And I think these different ways of learning are really useful. I really do. I think the whole education system has been it's been based on relatively standardised ways. So I do think it's going to be this way of taking advantage of the technology where there's just but that's a frightening thing. Like, I completely understand as well. There's a lot of people out there who worry about the speed of these things and worry about how quickly it's changing. And you've seen that, I think, in so many different technologies, whether that's either people worrying about mobile phones previously, or worrying about things like cameras or electric hire bikes. It seems to be the kind of thing. So it's really important for the tech industry to be transparent about the impact, to try and give guidance, to try and give training to do it. Because I think this is something that this isn't a technology that's going away. I think everyone's now starting to realise that this is something that is going to have continued. And I do think, in some ways, I don't think it's anything different to what we've seen before. I think that humans in themselves, we tend to always overestimate the short term, and we tend to underestimate the long term impacts of stuff. And I think, so sometimes there's been all these scare stories of, is AI taking my job? Is this all happening now? And I think that's all a bit probably overblown. I think in the long term, it will become so key to what pretty much how everyone lives their life. And I think it's just, we need to get that from an ethical and a bias perspective. We really need to get that. And I think in recruitment it's interesting where you look at how much information should you give to some of these AIs in terms of actually application candidate tracking systems. How do you stop it being biased against certain names or locations or genders or upbringings or school? I mean, all of that stuff is, if you were to look at I'm sure if you were to take a large investment bank and you were to say, right, we want to hire people, we think these people do well within the investment bank. Well, all of a sudden you're going to put all these inherent biases around it. And it's just really important we know and we understand where that's happening, because the scope that we have for making damaging mistakes is pretty large at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, bias is one of the big things that we cover in recruitment, because it's always hard because there's that unconscious bias. But if, again, you can tackle that in a way by taking measures. So, for example, we will work processes where we completely anonymise CVs when we send them over to our clients, so they don't know, and there's no indication markers at all. But again, if you're using a system that has bias trained into it, that's so hard to detect and people will automatically trust it as well.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because you almost have different data. It's the different data sets that you have which almost have proxy bias sitting within it. So if you look at so insurance and loans have been one that I've seen before previously, where you could almost say effectively that there'd been bias in terms of either race or economic background, because they've looked at certain areas, and the reality, you have certain areas that have different layouts in terms of race and peace, and it's just a really interesting area that sits around it. I grew up in a not great area in West London. I think if you'd plotted my career forward from where I grew up, I would be very unlikely to have been chosen for the roles and the things that I came up with. So I think it's really important that we make sure that we understand where the bias is within the data, that we make sure that we build. I mean, it's at the end of the day, the world is ours to build in the way that we want to build it, and I think that's the really important thing. That all of these technologies, we are not beholden to technology in any way. It's up to us to steer it into what I personally want as a better, fairer, more equitable world, because I just think that's the right thing, and I just think that's a more interesting thing, quite honestly, as well.
Yeah, and I can see that's where you've driven your career as well. I mean, so I suppose, like you mentioned earlier, you do a lot within sort of quantum computing,
yes,
and sort of other areas. So I suppose, how do you approach the ethical considerations of those emerging technologies where they are newer and there's even less regulation or even less of history behind them, where you can draw back and take examples from to how we should utilise it moving forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how do I do that? So I think it's important to understand. So one, I think there's certain bits where it's important not to worry about questions. You always have to think about ethics, but I think it's important to understand the maturity of certain bits of the market. Like I do truly believe that, and I think the major thing we want is I want technology to move forward for a positive way overall. I think it's trying to understand the technology and the systems and the tools that we give to people, and what those implications could be. I think quantum is a really interesting area at the moment. I find it amazing that the variety and the scale of quantum computing that's in. I mean, you got that was with the UN 2 weeks ago. They're going to have a year of quantum in 2025, where effectively it's going forward. I suspect, if I was a betting man, I suspect in the same way that there's been this massive interest that's happened around AI, I think there's a decent chance that something similar to that will happen around quantum in the not too distant future, because I think as people see the implications it can have in material science, I think it's something. But again, that's something that we need to be, we really need to be quite cognizant of, for the sole reason that we need to make sure that we don't enable people to do harm through it. I mean, how do you do it in general? I think it's just a matter of, I think everything in history. So history doesn't repeat, but history definitely rhymes. I think it's extraordinarily important that we look back at the history of technology and what's happened, both within the short term of the rise of the microprocessor, but actually the longer terms of pre-industrial up to about the Industrial Revolution, because I think the things that are happening now are relatively similar, I would say, to the things that have happened before, whether that's either the rise of the typewriter and the Luddites smashing them, or the worries that, I mean, it always amazes me the worries that happened in terms of cities, of what happened when we removed horse-drawn horses from the whole thing.
Yeah.
And that's not long ago. That's the really weird thing. I mean, there was a view that there was almost going to be a fall of the cities back in it's about 980. I think I read an article with a newspaper from 1890 or so, and there was a view that because of the amount of pollution from horses, that cities were just going to be completely unlivable. And it's really interesting that you see that technology kind of helped with things at that time. So I think for me, looking at new technologies, how I take with the ethics, it's trying to learn from the things that have happened in parallels before. How have they been solved? What have the problems been? And how do they get resolved at that time?
That's interesting. It seems like we're almost always pining for our own destruction through sort of new technologies, almost.
Yeah, I think people are, I think every technology has the capability for good and bad, and I think, I don't think I've always thought before is, I don't think technology in itself should be amoral. Effectively, I think we do have to try and shape it in the way for positive outcomes, and I think you are seeing that more, actually. I think I was very pleased to see a lot of the stuff that happened around some of facial recognition, I think actually has gone in a positive way now. I think some of those fears that were there have been pulled back a little bit. But yeah, I think we need to, as a tech industry, it's just really important that we work together, both with people, with government, with regulators, that we take people along the journey on this, because I think there is this just huge benefit that can come from a societal level, and we need to really work on that to make sure we get the right thing out of it.
I suppose then how do you, so obviously in the private sector it's usually around benefit for individual companies, so how do you, so obviously there's a societal benefit, but I suppose what's the push for these companies to work together and sort of create a coalition on this?
I think fundamentally, so it's interesting when you look at how companies work. We often now talk about this whole co-petition side of things. So I think there's such an ecosystem around it. I think it becomes increasingly important for people to work together. How do you do it? I suppose that's kind of the interesting question. I mean, I think stuff like there was the AI summit the other week, the global summit. I think piece that we got COP20 whatever it is next week over in Dubai. I think there is definitely a place for governments to try and bring people together to have these discussions. I think that's really important. And I think from a company perspective, the other thing that's really important is that people have this growth mindset. I'm a firm believer in the way that we can grow the pie. We can make the world better for everyone. For one company to succeed, it doesn't mean that other companies have to fail. That's my firm belief with the world. And I think when I look into the considerations that come around AI, the more that we can grow the size of the market, and we want people's lives to get better. We want to try and increase this, just because because we can get something that helps do some of our work. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to work less. I think there's so many interesting things out there that I would like to do, and I think for me, there's all kinds of things I use to automate my life, as weird as it sounds, that enable me to do more of the things that I want to do, whether that's either reading or learning or spending time with my family or whatever it is. I think the whole thing that we need to try and work out as a group together is to try and increase that positive impact for people.
Yeah, I would agree. I suppose, this time has absolutely flown from how we've spoken, but I suppose rounding it out on the final question, which is related to what we were just talking about, how can companies, I suppose, like AWS, take a leadership role in promoting ethical practices? And do you have any advice, I suppose, for other tech leaders who might be listening in?
Yeah, I think, how do we promote ethical practices? I mean, we've really tried to build a more diverse and equitable workforce and world. We do so many things so take AWS Restart, for example. So we run one of the largest retraining programs that I think exist in the UK to try and retrain people into the IT workforce. If I look at some of our AI education side of things, again, we're making these really large commitments to do it. And I suppose, why are we doing that is probably a good question. I think charity is an interesting thing. I think charity kind of works until people stop doing charity.
Yeah.
And I think the key thing that we've done is to understand those benefits so we can grow the overall market. So a lot of the work that I do is to try to work out how do we increase the size and the scale of pieces that sit around it. What's the advice that I'd have for people? I think people need to understand the landscape that they exist within, and people need to prepare for change as well, as weird as it sounds. I think the one constant that I could say 100% is that things will change faster next year than they have this year. I'd put a very strong bet on. So getting to a situation where you equip your workforce, you equip your leaders actually to be able to cope with those changes, I think it's going to be increasingly important. I do think as well that we've seen, if I look at boards and I look at senior people, I think increasingly we're seeing a more and more importance in actual deep technical knowledge within things, and I think that's a very good thing personally. I think the days of kind of hand wavy gestures of things that people didn't necessarily understand are starting to go, and I think part of that is people are able to try things. I mean, the advice I'd give to people, if you're listening to this now or watching this, it's some of the stuff we talked about, so like quantum computing or LLMs. Go on and play with them, and I don't mean just in the sparse version of going on and asking popular chat based interface what what you should have for dinner or to make a poem. I mean, in terms of just building simplistic apps around it is amazing the power that sits in it. And I think if you can do that, and then in an enterprise sense, doing that with your own data, I think is just really, really powerful. And I think while you're doing all of that, making sure that you think of what are the first and second order implications that come with it. What are the knock on it? What are the, almost to quote Donald Rumsfeld, like it's the known unknowns, it's the unknown unknowns, and how do you cut down that scope of unknown unknowns? And I think there's so much fun to it. There's so much benefit that can come from this as a technology, but it's doing it in the right way. It's making sure that we understand the implications. It's making sure that we understand the bias that's coming in the data. It is unbelievably more important than anything else that the future that we build for my children and for everyone else's children is a brighter future than we have today. And I think, that's something that we just need to get right. So I think it's important people think that and understand the implications that come around it.
Do you think you need the right? So you mentioned that technology, a lot of leadership and sort of board level leadership now are more sort of technology savvy, and I think that comes down to probably data literacy and other areas. I could do a whole other episode on data literacy, to be honest. But I suppose, how important, and I would ask this question because I'm a recruiter, but how important is getting the right people in, so with that sort of right technical knowledge or right strategic knowledge, I think, as well?
I mean, I think it's more important than ever. I really do. I think the major thing that holds a lot of businesses back is the skills and the people, I think, by a massive amount. I think increasingly the impact that I think it is unbelievable, actually, the impact that small numbers of very good senior people can have on an organisation is just absolutely amazing. And I think especially in this kind of new space, I think, I would recommend people to try and find thought leaders, and also as well the people that you have, make sure that they're growing. There's a bunch of places that I've worked over the years that don't really train anyone. I mean, I think that's a moderately common thing of talking to people who've never had any kind of training or never had any downtime. We go to a situation where for us once a month we have a repurpose day where people are encouraged to go and do something different. We have once a week we encourage people to have a refocus day where they give them more time to try and to play with things. I think fundamentally so much of this relates to getting the right people, putting them in the right roles, and giving them the space and the ability to kind of flourish around it. And I think that really does just require, that kind of real dedication to making sure that you get the right people for roles. Even if that takes longer, I think people are just absolutely key to, especially people with deep past experience, that have actually done it. And those people are more in demand now than they ever have, because it's, it is a small, fast-moving industry. So yeah.
I mean, one final question. I know I said that 2 questions ago, but I mean, at that sort of senior leadership level, because I work quite a bit with, and my network is very much consistent of those people. And I would say at the moment, because of the year that we've had in terms of 2020, and there have been economic constraints, sort of both global and localised to the UK, other issues as well, sort of over-hiring issues, I suppose, in 21 and 22. I think there are more of these types of leaders on the market in terms of out of roles than there ever have been. I suppose what do you think the knock-on effect will be, I suppose, for AI and data?
I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think the overall tech talent market has been, I think, probably slightly more static than it has been for a while, if I'm honest. I think you've seen kind of knock-on implications of a number of large firms slow down their hiring or keep it into specific areas. Like we still see, we often see growth in one area, and I think that's the irony sometimes of people that have grown in their AI practice but not grown in their data practice. I think that's always you've got to get the data bit right if you want the AI, the shiny AI bit to work. I think there is a lot of talent out there. I think you can definitely see the green shoots of recovery. We're going into a year with a presidential election next year. We've got a British election as well. Normally when you look from a historic economic perspective, there's normally quite a lot of positive growth in those years for maybe for obvious reasons or maybe just through coincidence. So I'm kind of hoping that next year will be a good year from a growth and a tech perspective. I almost feel there's going to be a a rush to the door, if that makes sense, or a rush to get those people. So I think it's going to be really interesting. If I was the board on something large, I would be really looking now to hire the senior leaders that I wanted to come in. I think there's not that long, and I think you'll just suddenly see this. I do really think actually you'll see this kind of you'll see a lot more changes, I think, within the IT landscape next year than there has been this year. And I think, we talk to all kinds of people about stuff, and I think you can definitely see this circumstance coming up where effectively the forward-thinking companies are now really starting to get very, very serious about some of their senior hires. And I think that will come in quite quickly with kind of an interesting knock-on. And now is the time to do it. I mean,
I would agree.
Yeah, it really is. If you want to hire high-quality talent, you're probably better doing it before everyone else does.
And it's cheaper as well, because if everyone else is going for the same talent, naturally, if you're in demand, you're going to put your prices up a bit, which I think is completely natural considering they're having to lower things at the moment.
Well, that and I think, the whole thing with this is because you can, if you think effectively if you get your AI strategy right, it's like building a giant fulcrum where every time you put one bit of effort down on there, you get a huge move on the other side.
Yeah.
So it becomes extremely important. I mean, if you have a situation where effectively you can just change the productivity of your developers by 30, 40, 50, 60% by doing the right strategies, right? The time and the advantage that you can get in that is absolutely fantastic. And so I think you will see some of these the companies that do this right will have huge spoils coming to them. Actually, I think there's a real interesting upsides. But that's going to be a hard thing for folks to do, and that requires the right people in the right place, right time.
I was going to say, because it's not, AI isn't everything, but I think it will give, like you said, if companies do it right, it will give them a natural advantage going into the next sort of 10 years, the next decade, and like you said, the right people, finding, knowing what your issues are in terms of data and AI, and then hiring based off those, and taking your time a little bit with it, and understanding and matching efficiently, rather than just trying to get someone in just to fill a hole, or get someone in almost just as a placeholder, or even just a namesake. You want to get the person who can come in and really solve your issues, which is going to be integral.
I think that, and then making sure that the folk that you have at the moment, that you're upskilling and you're giving the space to go and create new things. It always amazes me when you look at Google Maps, for example, was something that was created in someone's 20% spare time at Google. The things that companies can create off the back of effectively giving their high quality employees time and space to develop, the motivation, the ownership that comes around it, I think is incredible. And I think if you tag that with a senior leader that can come in and inspire and drive them, there's all kinds of fun stuff that will come from that.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Jon. It's been an amazing conversation. And is there anything that people should be aware of that's upcoming, I suppose, in your line of work?
We've got reInvent next week. There's all kinds of interesting stuff that will come out in reInvent, which will be fascinating. Actually, I think there's a bunch of really interesting stuff coming. That, and if people haven't done it, I would just recommend playing with Party Rock. It's just so much fun. You can chain together effectively some LLMs, some pictures that come out of stuff. It's really, I think it's going to be really interesting to see LLMs as a platform. I think there is going to be this situation where people are able to build apps that are very specific for themselves or their use cases, and put it back onto them. And I think that's something that you're going to see increasingly us help people do.
Amazing. I'll definitely be checking it out. I'll have a play around with it with my limited technical knowledge as well. But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in, and obviously we'll be coming with a couple more episodes on this topic, and then sort of reconvening a little bit later on for a live Q&A panel. But keep tuned in.